They say love is blind, but evil? Evil sees everything. Melissa Hartwell had been studying her husband's morning routine for 6 weeks, calculating exactly how much poison his body could absorb before the insurance investigators would start asking questions. This morning, as she handed David his coffee with that practiced smile, she wondered if he could taste the foxglove extract that would make her a widow by Christmas. The insurance policy was worth $2 million, enough to fund the new life Melissa had been planning in Costa Rica with her lover Marcus. David's recent health issues would provide the perfect cover for what would appear to be a tragic but natural death from an undiagnosed heart condition. Everyone would remember how devotedly Melissa had cared for her ailing husband during his final months. Melissa had perfected the art of being the ideal suburban wife over 12 years of marriage. She hosted dinner parties that neighbors still talked about months later, volunteered at the local animal shelter, and maintained a garden that was featured in the regional home magazine. Her carefully curated social media presence showed a woman living her best life, grateful for every blessing. But beneath the Pinterest-perfect exterior, Melissa felt suffocated by the predictable routine of her marriage. David was a good man who loved her genuinely, but he was also boring, content with their quiet life in ways that made Melissa feel like she was slowly disappearing. She'd married him at 25 because he represented security and stability, not realizing that security could feel like a prison by the time she turned 37. The affair with Marcus had started 8 months ago when he'd renovated their kitchen. He was everything David wasn't: dangerous, unpredictable, and completely focused on immediate gratification rather than long-term planning. Marcus made Melissa feel alive in ways she'd forgotten were possible, awakening parts of her personality that had been dormant for over a decade. When Marcus suggested they could be together permanently if David were out of the picture, Melissa had initially been shocked by the implication. But the seed had been planted, and she'd found herself researching untraceable poisons and studying David's life insurance policies with growing interest. The fantasy of starting over in a new country with unlimited resources and a passionate lover had become an obsession. Melissa had chosen digitalis, extracted from foxglove flowers she grew in her own garden. The poison would gradually weaken David's heart, creating symptoms that would mimic natural cardiac problems. She'd been adding tiny amounts to his morning coffee, watching with clinical fascination as his health slowly deteriorated exactly as she'd planned. David's doctor had been puzzled by his declining condition, ordering multiple tests that revealed elevated heart enzymes but no clear diagnosis. Melissa played the worried wife perfectly, researching specialists and pushing for more aggressive treatment while secretly hoping the medical intervention would interfere with her careful poisoning schedule. The most disturbing aspect of her plan wasn't the murder itself, but how easily she'd adapted to living a complete lie. Melissa found herself studying David's face during breakfast, cataloging the subtle changes in his complexion and energy levels while maintaining loving conversation about their weekend plans. She'd become a skilled actress, capable of expressing genuine concern for the health problems she was causing. David had started talking about making changes to their lifestyle, worried that stress from work might be affecting his heart. He'd suggested they take a vacation together, maybe renew their wedding vows on their upcoming anniversary. His genuine love and concern for their marriage made Melissa's deception feel even more powerful and intoxicating. Melissa had calculated that David needed approximately 2 more weeks of gradual poisoning before the digitalis would cause fatal heart failure. She'd already purchased her plane ticket to San Jose, told Marcus about the timing, and prepared cover stories about needing time alone to grieve after David's inevitable death. The plan was flawless, untraceable, and completely consistent with her reputation as a devoted wife who'd done everything possible to save her husband's life. When David died, Melissa would inherit everything, collect the insurance money, and disappear to start her new life within months of the funeral. She watched David struggle to finish his coffee, noting how his hands trembled slightly from the accumulated poison in his system. He smiled at her with such genuine affection that for a moment Melissa almost felt guilty about what she was doing. But the feeling passed quickly, replaced by anticipation for the freedom that his death would provide. David mentioned feeling dizzy again and asked if Melissa thought he should call his cardiologist. She suggested he rest for the day, maybe work from home so she could keep an eye on him. Her concern appeared genuine and loving, masking the calculation behind every caring gesture. As David headed to his home office, moving more slowly than usual, Melissa began planning her day. She needed to water her foxglove garden, maintain the source of David's poison while appearing to tend her beloved flowers. This afternoon, she would call Marcus to confirm their meeting later that evening, where they would finalize the details of their post-murder life together. Melissa cleaned the breakfast dishes methodically, washing David's coffee cup with extra care to remove any traces of the poison she'd administered. She'd become expert at covering her tracks, eliminating evidence while maintaining her facade of domestic perfection. The insurance investigator would find nothing suspicious when David died. Their marriage appeared happy and stable, with no obvious motives for murder. Melissa's grief would seem genuine because she'd had months to practice the emotional responses expected of a devastated widow. She looked out the kitchen window at her prize-winning garden, where foxglove flowers bloomed alongside roses and lavender in a display that brought compliments from every visitor. Nobody suspected that her horticultural expertise served a darker purpose, that she'd cultivated beauty and death in the same carefully tended space. Melissa's phone buzzed with a text from Marcus asking about their timeline. She typed back that everything was proceeding as planned, that they would be together soon in paradise. The message felt like a promise and a threat simultaneously, binding her to a future that required David's death as the price of admission. She returned to her domestic routine, already anticipating the moment when she would finally be free to live authentically instead of hiding behind the mask of perfect wifehood that had become both her prison and her weapon. The psychology of evil isn't found in dark alleys or horror movies. It sits across from you at breakfast, wearing the face of someone you trust. Hannah Rodriguez had spent 3 months perfecting the art of making 10-year-old Kevin Martinez feel special, chosen, and completely dependent on her approval. Today, as she watched him linger after class to organize his backpack, she mentally reviewed the grooming techniques that would make tonight's tutoring session at her house feel like a privilege instead of a trap. Hannah had taught 4th grade for 8 years, earning recognition as Teacher of the Year twice and maintaining an impeccable reputation among parents and administrators. Her classroom was a warm, nurturing environment where struggling students flourished under her patient guidance. Nobody suspected that her extra attention to certain children served purposes far beyond educational support. Kevin came from a troubled home where his parents worked multiple jobs to make ends meet. He was often hungry, sometimes wore the same clothes for days, and desperately craved adult attention and validation. Hannah had identified him as the perfect target during the first week of school, recognizing his vulnerability and emotional needs. She'd started by keeping healthy snacks in her desk specifically for Kevin, making sure he understood that these treats were their special secret. Hannah would find reasons to keep him after class for extra help, gradually building a relationship that felt more intimate and personal than her interactions with other students. Kevin had begun to see her as his primary source of comfort and support. Hannah's method was subtle and patient. She'd compliment Kevin's appearance, tell him how special and mature he was compared to other children his age, and create opportunities for physical contact through high fives, shoulder squeezes, and brief hugs that lingered just slightly too long. Each interaction was designed to normalize inappropriate boundaries while making Kevin feel chosen and valued. The psychological manipulation was more sophisticated than simple grooming. Hannah was studying Kevin's emotional responses, learning which approaches made him feel most connected to her. She discovered that he responded strongly to feeling needed and important, so she'd begun asking his help with classroom tasks that made him feel trusted with adult responsibilities. Hannah had been documenting Kevin's reactions in a private journal, recording which compliments affected him most, how he responded to physical touch, and what signs of attachment and dependency she could observe. The detailed notes read like a clinical study of child psychology, but they served to optimize her manipulation techniques. She'd also been gradually isolating Kevin from potential support systems. Hannah would make subtle comments about how other adults didn't understand special children like Kevin, how his parents were too busy and stressed to appreciate what an exceptional boy he was, and how she was the only one who truly recognized his potential. Kevin had started staying in during recess to spend time in Hannah's classroom, preferring her exclusive attention to playing with classmates his own age. She'd encouraged this behavior by creating special projects they could work on together, making their relationship feel unique and irreplaceable. The school's child protection policies were extensive, but Hannah knew how to operate within the system while avoiding detection. She was careful about physical contact in public spaces, maintained professional documentation for all after-school interactions, and cultivated relationships with parents that positioned her as an exceptionally dedicated educator. Hannah's colleagues viewed her extended hours and special attention to struggling students as evidence of extraordinary commitment to teaching. When parents mentioned how much Kevin talked about his wonderful teacher at home, They interpreted it as proof of Hannah's positive impact on his academic and emotional development. But Hannah's motivations had nothing to do with education or child welfare. She'd been attracted to teaching specifically because it provided legitimate access to vulnerable children, allowing her to build inappropriate relationships under the cover of professional responsibility. Each student who became attached to her fed her need for control and dominance over innocent minds. Kevin had begun exhibiting signs of unhealthy attachment to Hannah. He became upset when she missed school due to illness, worried excessively about disappointing her, and started having difficulty concentrating when other adults tried to help him with schoolwork. His emotional dependency was exactly what Hannah had been cultivating. Hannah had started suggesting that Kevin might benefit from additional tutoring sessions at her home, where they could work without the distractions of the school environment. She'd presented the idea to his parents as educational support, emphasizing Kevin's potential and her commitment to helping him succeed academically. Kevin's parents had been grateful for Hannah's offer, viewing it as extraordinary generosity from a teacher who genuinely cared about their son's future. They'd praised Hannah to other parents, contributing to her reputation as an educator who went above and beyond for her students. The home tutoring sessions would provide Hannah with the privacy and control she needed to escalate her inappropriate relationship with Kevin, away from the oversight of school policies and potential witnesses. She could push boundaries that weren't possible in the classroom environment. Hannah had been preparing her home for Kevin's visits, creating a comfortable space where he would feel special and valued while being completely under her influence. She'd stocked his favorite snacks, set up games and activities designed to build intimacy and trust, and removed any potential sources of outside contact or interference. The psychological foundation Hannah had built over months of careful manipulation meant that Kevin would likely comply with her escalating demands without question. He trusted her completely, depended on her approval for his sense of self-worth, and believed that their relationship was both normal and beneficial. Hannah's plan was to gradually introduce more inappropriate elements into their tutoring sessions, testing Kevin's boundaries while reinforcing his dependency on her approval and attention. She'd studied enough child psychology to understand how to normalize behaviors that would seem obviously wrong to adults but could be confused and accepted by a vulnerable 10-year-old. As Hannah organized her classroom for the next day, she reviewed the permission slip Kevin's parents had signed for after-school tutoring at her home. Tomorrow would mark the beginning of a new phase in their relationship, one where Hannah could finally act on the desires she'd been carefully cultivating through months of professional manipulation. She looked forward to having Kevin completely under her control, away from parents and colleagues who might interfere with the special bond she'd been building with her chosen victim. Dr. Natalie Pierce adjusted her notepad as her patient. Jennifer Walsh settled into the familiar chair across from her office. Jennifer had been coming to therapy for 6 months to work through childhood trauma, trusting Natalie completely with her deepest psychological wounds. What Jennifer didn't know was that her therapist had been systematically exploiting those vulnerabilities to satisfy her own twisted need for psychological control and manipulation. Natalie had earned her doctorate in clinical psychology specifically to gain access to damaged minds she could exploit rather than heal. The therapeutic relationship provided perfect cover for her predatory behavior, allowing her to probe the most intimate details of people's psychological pain while maintaining a facade of professional concern and competence. Jennifer represented Natalie's ideal victim, intelligent, successful on the surface, but carrying deep emotional scars from childhood abuse that made her desperate for validation and healing. During their first session, Natalie had recognized Jennifer's profound vulnerability and hunger for maternal approval, psychological needs that could be weaponized with devastating effectiveness. Instead of helping Jennifer process her trauma in healthy ways, Natalie had been gradually increasing her dependency on their therapeutic relationship. She'd convinced Jennifer that her problems were more severe than other therapists could handle, that traditional therapeutic approaches wouldn't work for someone with her complex history, and that only Natalie possessed the expertise to guide her toward genuine healing. Natalie had been violating every ethical boundary of therapeutic practice while maintaining meticulous documentation that portrayed her methods as cutting-edge trauma treatment. Her session notes described innovative techniques and breakthrough therapeutic approaches that were actually sophisticated manipulation designed to increase Jennifer's psychological dependency. The psychological control Natalie wielded over Jennifer was intoxicating. She could trigger emotional reactions with carefully chosen words, manipulate Jennifer's self-perception through strategic feedback, and create crises that would drive Jennifer to seek additional sessions and support. Natalie had become addicted to the power of holding someone else's mental health in her hands. Jennifer had been making progress in some areas of her life, but Natalie actively undermined that growth by suggesting that surface improvements were actually defense mechanisms that prevented deeper healing. She'd convinced Jennifer that any positive changes were temporary and that abandoning therapy prematurely would result in complete psychological collapse. Natalie's manipulation extended beyond individual sessions to Jennifer's relationships and life choices. She'd planted doubts about Jennifer's friendships, suggested that romantic relationships were premature given her unresolved trauma, and positioned herself as the primary source of emotional support and guidance in Jennifer's life. The therapeutic techniques Natalie employed were sophisticated perversions of legitimate psychological methods. She used elements of cognitive behavioral therapy to reinforce Jennifer's negative self-beliefs, twisted mindfulness practices to increase emotional vulnerability, and corrupted trauma processing exercises to reopen old wounds rather than heal them. Jennifer had begun exhibiting signs of increased psychological distress despite months of intensive therapy. She was more anxious than when treatment started, increasingly isolated from friends and family, and completely dependent on Natalie for emotional regulation and decision-making support. The deterioration was exactly what Natalie had been orchestrating. Natalie charged premium rates for her specialized trauma treatment, billing Jennifer's insurance company for experimental therapeutic approaches that were actually sophisticated psychological abuse disguised as cutting-edge mental health care. The financial exploitation added another layer to her manipulation, making Jennifer literally pay to be psychologically damaged. The professional therapy community held Natalie in high regard, viewing her as an innovative practitioner who achieved remarkable results with difficult cases. She presented at conferences about breakthrough trauma treatment methods, PUBLISHED papers about complex therapeutic relationships, and mentored younger therapists who admired her apparent dedication and expertise. But Natalie's true motivation was the rush of psychological dominance she experienced by controlling another person's mental and emotional state. She discovered that she could induce panic attacks, trigger dissociative episodes, or create emotional crises in Jennifer through carefully calibrated therapeutic interventions presented as necessary healing work. Natalie had been gradually introducing more extreme therapeutic techniques, suggesting that Jennifer needed to explore even deeper levels of trauma to achieve genuine recovery. She'd proposed intensive weekend sessions, overnight retreats, and experimental treatments that would provide increased opportunities for manipulation and control. Jennifer's insurance coverage was approaching its annual limit, creating pressure for more intensive treatment approaches that Natalie presented as cost-effective ways to achieve faster therapeutic breakthroughs. The financial pressure added another element of control, making Jennifer feel desperate to resolve her issues quickly before losing access to treatment. Natalie had been documenting Jennifer's increasing dependency and psychological deterioration as evidence of therapeutic progress, describing her isolation and anxiety as necessary stages in the healing process. Her clinical notes painted a picture of difficult but essential therapeutic work rather than systematic psychological abuse. The power dynamic in their therapeutic relationship had become completely corrupted, with Jennifer viewing Natalie as her savior and primary source of hope, while Natalie secretly fed off Jennifer's psychological suffering. The professional boundaries that should have protected Jennifer had been systematically violated and weaponized against her. Natalie's treatment of Jennifer represented a masterpiece of psychological manipulation disguised as professional mental health care. She'd taken a vulnerable person seeking healing and transformed her into a psychologically dependent victim while maintaining her reputation as an exceptional therapist committed to patient welfare. As their session concluded, Jennifer thanked Natalie for her patience and expertise, expressing gratitude for having found someone who truly understood her complex psychological needs. The irony was perfect. Jennifer was thanking her abuser for the privilege of being systematically psychologically destroyed under the guise of therapeutic treatment. Natalie scheduled their next session, already planning the emotional manipulation she would employ to deepen Jennifer's dependency and psychological instability. Each session brought new opportunities to exploit Jennifer's vulnerabilities while reinforcing Natalie's addictive sense of complete psychological control over another human being. She watched Jennifer leave her office, noting the signs of increased anxiety and emotional fragility that months of therapeutic abuse had produced, and felt satisfied with the psychological destruction she'd accomplished while maintaining her facade as a caring mental health professional. Carolyn Mitchell listened intently as her best friend Sarah poured her heart out about her marriage problems, nodding with apparent sympathy while secretly recording every vulnerable detail on her hidden phone app. Sarah had no idea that her closest confidant for 15 years was actually a master manipulator who'd been systematically destroying her life while playing the role of supportive best friend. Caroline had perfected the art of being indispensable to the people around her, positioning herself as the ultimate confidant and support system while secretly orchestrating the very problems she pretended to help solve. Sarah's marriage, career setbacks, and social isolation were all products of Caroline's careful manipulation, executed with such skill that Sarah viewed her as a lifeline rather than the source of her destruction. The friendship had started in college when both women were struggling to find their place in an intimidating academic environment. Caroline had recognized Sarah's insecurities and potential immediately, understanding that someone with Sarah's genuine kindness and trusting nature would make an ideal long-term victim for Mefter, psychological manipulation and control. Over 15 years, Caroline had systematically isolated Sarah from other meaningful relationships by subtly undermining her confidence in family members, romantic partners, and potential friends. She'd mastered the technique of offering comfort after creating the very problems that required consoling, establishing herself as Sarah's primary source of emotional support and guidance. Caroline's manipulation of Sarah's marriage had been particularly sophisticated. She'd spent 2 years planting doubts about David's faithfulness, sharing fabricated stories about seeing him with other women, and encouraging Sarah to question his commitment and honesty. When Sarah's paranoia and accusations finally drove David to seek separation, Caroline had been there to provide shoulder to cry on and validate Sarah's sense of betrayal. The psychological control Caroline wielded over Sarah was complete and intoxicating. She could influence Sarah's career decisions, romantic choices, and family relationships through carefully placed suggestions and emotional manipulation. Sarah had become so dependent on Caroline's approval and guidance that she rarely made significant decisions without extensive consultation and validation. Caroline had been monetizing their friendship in ways Sarah never suspected. She'd encourage Sarah to confide details about her family's financial situation, then use that information to manipulate investment decisions and insurance policies for her own benefit. Caroline had also been selling Sarah's personal information to marketing companies and using her identity for various financial schemes. The most disturbing aspect of Caroline's behavior was how much she enjoyed Sarah's psychological suffering. Each crisis Caroline manufactured provided her with entertainment and a sense of power that had become addictive. She'd learned to calibrate her manipulations perfectly, creating enough drama to maintain control while avoiding destruction so complete that Sarah might seek help elsewhere.